The following interview with Edwin H. Wilson, founder of the American Humanist Movement, was filmed March 1992 in the Friendship Manor residence of William A. Helmick in Salt Lake City, Utah. Dr. Wilson discusses his youth, his education, his career as a Unitarian minister, and events leading to the formation of the American Humanist Association. Following his death at age 94, on March 24th of 1993, the American Humanist Association published Dr. Wilson's book, The Genesis of a Humanist Manifesto, which details the events leading to organized humanism in the United States. Dr. Wilson is interviewed by Flo Wineriter, at that time president of the Humanists of Utah.
We want to find out, first of all, about your background, where you were born, about your education, and some of the highlights of your earlier days.
Well, I grew up in Massachusetts, but I actually was born in Queens. I was my parents' fourth child, but I arrived as a 7-month child. And so I came into this world without benefit of the medical profession. They didn't talk about those things in New England. I didn't know till I was 26 years old about the circumstances of my birth. But my father was up in Concord getting a place for us to live because he'd taken a new position there. And I was born on August 23rd, 1898. And I was christened in 1898 in the First Parish Church at Concord. They are called parishes there. And that church was supported by the state, by the town. St. Bridget's and the First Parish Church were getting tax money way up in the 1850s when the Unitarians voluntarily stopped it on devotion to the church and state.
So you were christened in a Unitarian church?
I'm a birthright Unitarian. And then I don't remember very much about religious education except that we were bobbing for apples at a Halloween party, and the man who poked my head under said I kicked his shins and fought like a tiger. I also remember that I smoked my first cigar after a men's meeting. They had us in there waiting on table, and it made me terribly ill. But they were very spiritual experiences. But I had, on the whole, very pleasant experiences in the church there.
Just as an aside, what was your father's livelihood?
My father was a contractor and a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
He had, it was in the days before automobile trucks, and he'd have about 80 heavy draft horses. And if there were anything heavy to be moved, right, he would be called on to move it. He was an agnostic, and that's another story. But my mother was a devout Unitarian Christian of the old school, taught me the Lord's Prayer at her knees.
Mm-hmm.
And I came back to that later. But I graduated from Concord High School in 1916, took a year's postgraduate course, and started in night school at Northeastern College, a YMCA college. My mother always wanted me to go to Harvard. We didn't have the money in the family for that, and I didn't have the time and the equipment for it.
Mm-hmm.
But anyhow,
What was your goal when you started to college?
What
was your goal when you started college?
Oh, well, I started. I went. I was going into business.
I see.
I think my motivation was seeing when I would be up to milk cows or work on the farm at 6 in the morning, and then I'd see the dudes going down to take the 7:22 train to Boston, working in an office. I decided on a business career.
Now, typical of most of us, we'd like to do something other than what our folks did.
Yeah, well, I did have a couple of jobs. Wound up the Boston Ice Company and checked in the coupons and the people. Then later when I was earning my way through, I I sold gas light fixtures for the Boston Consolidated Gas Company, and I learned some of the tricks of salesmanship.
Mm-hmm.
But I started in for a business, going to business college, but then I had to wait. I tried for 2 years to get into the air service, and finally in the early autumn of 1918, for the armistice, I was shipped to Cornell University, and we had a choice, and the armistice came to stay in, learn to fly, and I didn't know any better, so I stayed in. Learned to fly those Jennies, got my commission, my wings, on a minimum amount of flying. And then when I came out, I finished up at Boston University days, working nights for Boston for, what was that? Who did I work for? Well, it was a big corporation that made pipe fittings and valves, Walworth Manufacturing Company. And I was working for them nights, going to school days. And I was on this night shift that got through at about 11:30 at the time of the Boston police strike. And came back by streetcar, and rocks were thrown through the window. Some people I didn't happen to get hurt, but some on the plane got cut with flying glass. And by the time I got to Park Street, surfaced, they were shooting craps all over the Boston Common. Because then Calvin Coolidge called out the military, which he should have done weeks earlier. But by coming in late, he made a great dramatic show of the thing, and they got him into the White House. Well, one of my jobs before I went in the Army was with the State Secretary of Agriculture. I had been working for him in Concord. In fact, he left me in charge of the shipping of 1,000 crates of berries when he had to go to a conference. And I had 100 berry pickers that me. One of them pulled a knife on me when I fired him. But I had some responsibility for that harvest, that crop. I didn't do any harm. So then he gave me a job in the State House in the Department of Agriculture, sort of a gopher. Henry Ford was shipping tractors to the state of Massachusetts, and he sent them on a sight draft, and because Massachusetts was notoriously slow in paying its bills, and they had to get a special schedule out and send me up to the Secretary of State, and then the Lieutenant Governor was none other than Calvin Coolidge. And I went in where he was, and he never looked at me, just signed it in the photographs. But it was a good experience there. That was before I went to Cornell, where they shipped me to Texas, where then I did most of my flying in Oklahoma. Well, that brought me back. I got my BBA, and I got very bored with business, and got interested in Second Church Boston. Began to think of the church as a place for continuing education, because they got me doing some thinking that my business administration course was very little on humanities in it, hadn't done. And that's when I ran on to humanism, because my dear cousin Martha, whose husband had been the secretary of the American Unitarian Association, as it was called then, said, "Now don't let those humanists out at Meadville take away your faith." Well, this shocked me. I'd heard Sanford Bates, the U.S. prison commissioner, tell about Unitarian freedom, and there wasn't one belief he had that he wouldn't change on short notice. We ran into a new fact. So I had this challenge about the defensiveness that I hadn't experienced in my Unitarianism against new truth. See, I came from Emerson's hometown, Concord, and I'd read his Self-Reliance before I was 18. And trust yourself is his word. Every heart vibrates to that iron tune. Anyway, on the trip going to Meadville, Pennsylvania, where the school was then before it shifted, later it went to Chicago, on the train, in the smoking room, I encountered a professor of philosophy from some Western. His name was Alexander, and he sounded me out. And then he said, "What a shame for a bright young man like you to be throwing his life away on a dying profession."
The dying profession being
the ministry.
Mm.
And those were fighting words. We argued half the night. And I got finally to Meadville, Pennsylvania, and walked up the hill to Divinity Hall, and there were 3 students packing up to go, and it was the beginning of term. I said, "What are you leaving the beginning of term for?" And they said, "Well, we're humanists, and the faculty's made it quite clear to us we're not appreciated here." Well, they left. There were 3 good men. One became a professor of anatomy, another a professor of English, and another the president of an Eastern college. 3 good men lost to the ministry by the old-type humanists, old-type Unitarians, I mean. And so that was my first spring at Meadville, 1924. And by June of that, I went there in January, by June of that year, I had decided that I was a humanist.
Who were these humanists that influenced you at that time? Do you recall?
Well, they were students. They were students.
I see.
Do you know their names, Ed? Or have you forgotten?
Oh, they were of an earlier generation. Jack Winters became also there were others in there, the Society for Radical Religion. They had a student organization.
So these humanists were your peers, and rather than
upper class ahead of me. Jack Winters became a veterinary surgeon, and there had been a long tradition of revolt among the Meadville students then, and it continued. But I decided that this is it. Humanism has got science, human need, and time on its side. And where I get the idea that humanism follows science.
Now, when you first began to feel you were a humanist, were there philosophers that you had read that led you to this humanist philosophy?
Well, that's what I did the first springs. I read everything on humanism I could get a hold of.
Now, who were the people you were reading at that time on humanism?
Well, the timing would be a little difficult to get. Of course, I read Reese. I read that Reese had talked to the Unitarian laymen at a conference at Harvard College, and he'd said God is philosophically possible, scientifically unproved, and religiously unnecessary, which seemed to sum it right up. And
that convinced you right there, I guess.
Well, that went a long way. You see,
I think maybe it was time to call it a day for today.
Well, it's a bad place to break
If
on
you
this.
want to finish this thought, then all right.
Yeah, this. In 1917, Curtis Reese was giving a talk at Des Moines, Iowa, on the religion of democracy, and John Dietrich, the minister at Minneapolis, who had been preaching on humanism and published an annual volume of his sermons under the title Humanist Sermons, Dietrich said, "What you're calling the religion of democracy, I'm calling humanism."
I see.
And Reese said he liked the idea, liked the word. And they shook hands on it, and Reese changed the name of his first book from the religion of democracy to humanism. And then he wrote another book called The Meaning of Humanism, which is very popular. I even printed an edition of 1,000 copies of it at my own expense and distributed them. It's out of print still. But
When did you
but
do
that brought us right up to 1933. But the beginnings of the humanist movement were in the Unitarian Church, largely Unitarian Church, but also partly Universalist and the Ethical Society. But the early struggles were over creed or no creed. And at General Assembly after General Assembly, they called them May meetings then, there'd be an effort to put a dogma across, a creed, and the no creed people will always get an amendment to it, an escape clause saying neither this or any other statement shall be used as a creed to exclude anyone from fellowship.
That's probably a good place to stop for tonight. And when next time we meet, let's talk about this relationship between Unitarianism and humanism and how this all developed. Is that all right with you?
Well, that's all right. If you want to set this, you're all set up. I'm good for another half hour.
Well, it's all right with me. How do you feel about it? Is that all right with you?
It's a little. I have in mind the situation I used to have up in Cocoa Beach. The church people would say, "We want to use your house." It was a nice place built around a swimming pool, and the smokers could stay out around the pool. We'd put all the ashtrays out there, and they'd say, "You don't have to do a thing. We'll come in." But I always had to pick the house up before they came in and pick up afterward.
Since you've already picked up tonight, you'd like to keep going.
Yeah, you won't get this place in as clear as it is right another time. And I'd rather pick up from that point.
Yeah.
The only concern we have is that we get you too tired and that you'll be sick.
You mean I got you tired out?
No, we'll get you too tired.
No, don't worry about that.
Well, then should we go on? Have some juice.
You want to take a drink or anything?
Do you want some?
Well, you see, this conflict over creed left it free that the unbeliever could belong to the church. One minister reportedly said he wanted the basis of fellowship in his church at St. Paul to be so free that even the hypothetical atheist, if he came wanting to join them in well-doing, would be welcome. Mm-hmm. Well, they got him on a widespread scale among the Unitarians. I mean, the atheists, they have them today. Mm-hmm. And that was because they established the freedom for the membership in the church. Well, next came the ministers like Reese and Dietrich, who wanted the same freedom for the pulpit. And they were opposed violently in demands to throw them out of the denomination by people like William Lawrence Sullivan, an ex-priest, very eloquent person, or George Dodson, a Unitarian minister in St. Louis, who also taught philosophy in Washington University. And they called it a conflict between the God-man and the no-God-man. And Leon Burkhead, the minister at Kansas City, talked to Raymond Bragg. I'm going out there next week or soon for a Bragg symposium, and said we ought to get out a ringing declaration with a non-theistic point of view. And he was the spark, but from that point on, Bragg was the quarterback. And he and I were working like that, but it was an editorial committee of 4. Curtis Reese, Ray Bragg, myself, and Professor A.E. Hayden, that got an original draft written by Professor Roywood Sellers of University of Michigan. And Sellers had written a book on humanism, the next step in religion. And so that this first draft written by Sellers, we rewrote and sent out to a lot of people for criticism and input. And some people who had a hand in shaping the manifesto wouldn't sign it. I'm speaking particularly of John Haynes Holmes of the Community Church in New York, and who was some of the others. Max Otter wouldn't sign it because he was against such declarations. He says you say something, you think you've done something. But he was, again, had this fear of a creed, kept him out. Bushman, who with me was co-owner of the manifesto of the humanists, New Humanists. When we published the manifesto, after all the criticism, it was a consensus document, many changes from many sources, and 34 signers. When we printed it, it was in the New Humanist, which legally, Harold Bushman, the editor, and I, as managing editor, were the owners. There was no humanist organization. And
it was just a magazine called The New Humanist.
Yes, it had been started by students at the University of Chicago and at Meadville. But
Can I back up just a minute? You told us a story recently about the conflict within Unitarianism and the so-called Western problem.
Yeah.
Could you elucidate a little bit on that again?
Well, the Western problem was that of a group that wanted complete freedom of belief and no creed. That was a no creed.
And these were ministers who were west of Chicago, of the Unitarian Church?
Yeah. Most of those ministers, we went as far east as Schenectady. We
west
had the
of the
ministers.
Alleghenies, wasn't it? Wasn't it west of the Allegheny Mountains?
Well,
when you referred to the Western problem, I was wondering geographically what that meant.
Well, it was Midwest, centered in Cleveland.
I see.
I mean in Chicago. But, well...
Were these people then instrumental in writing for the New Humanist magazine and bringing this to the forefront?
We had certain goals in the magazine, which was to find new young writers, to put it on an academic level, good high standards academically. And after the New Humanists folded up, my church burned down in Austin, and I couldn't raise money for a new church and keep the magazine going.
You were where, in Austin, Texas?
Austin, Illinois.
Oh, Austin, Illinois.
Okay.
West side.
How did the church burn?
It was apparently incendiary arson. It wasn't anti-creed because there was a fire started almost the same night in the Baptist church and in the Austin High School and at a local bank. There was a firebug around.
So he didn't.
They
the
caught
firebug
him.
just didn't attack the Unitarian Church there.
It was not doctrinal.
Not doctrinal. Okay.
But that led to a halt of the publication of the New Humanist. He ran little humanist bound copies someplace here.
What year was that, Ed?
That fire would have been in well, I went to Chicago in 32, and it was it'd be about shortly after the manifesto was signed, or before, probably 32, shortly after I got to Chicago.
What was the reception of this Humanist Manifesto #1?
Well, in spite of the fact that we made a tactical error of putting it in the hands of Associated Press and not giving it to the other presses at the same time, so that only Associated Press touched it. It got enough publicity so that the religious press blasted us. If we hadn't said the time has passed for theism, deism, and so forth, they'd have ignored it. But now Charles Clayton Morrison was editor of Christian Century, and I'd had an article in Christian Century in 1929 on the conversion of a militarist, and But he had a fit when this came out. His associate editor had to stay up all night rewriting his angry editorial. It was so bad. But
The Christian Century was a publication of what denomination?
it was non-denominational, but the leading Protestant.
Leading Protestant
Still
organization.
is, yeah.
Mhm.
But
Was the manifesto one published as a Unitarian document or independent of
we were independent.
independent?
Although I published it right from the Third Unitarian Church,
Mm-hmm.
as I did this church here for 3 years.
Mm-hmm. So you were serving both as a Unitarian minister
Yeah.
and as a leader of the humanist movement simultaneously.
I was very conscientious about doing my church job.
Mm-hmm.
Martha Stewart told me that I'd called on her when Heather was born, called on her at the hospital. But it was a routine part of my job. I'd forgotten it.
Mm-hmm.
But
So, Ed, were you editor then?
A managing editor.
A managing editor. For how many years? Starting when?
well, I was managing editor of the New Humanist from 28 to about 39.
So about
And then I
11
became
years.
editor in 41 when we started the new series. They date the Humanist magazine. That's why they had a 50th anniversary issue in 91. But I must have edited it for a total of 16 years.
Mm-hmm.
The first time was 13 years. And then when Jerry Went became ill, the editor, they brought me in on sort of a caretaker basis, and I edited three and a half years more.